In a world that never stops demanding your attention, there is a hidden corner of the earth where the clocks have forgotten how to tick, and the only thing required of you is to simply breathe. The train journey to the coast of Maine had been a long, rhythmic lullaby. For Elias, a man whose life was usually measured in minutes and digital notifications, the slow transition from the steel and glass skyline of the city to the rugged, pine-scented air of the Atlantic was more than just a change in scenery. It was a shedding of skin. By the time the train pulled into the small, fog-dusted station in Camden, the frantic buzz in his mind had softened into a low, distant hum. He stepped onto the platform, his boots making a solid, grounded sound on the damp wood. It was late autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt spray and decaying maple leaves. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite, but rather felt like a firm, bracing handshake. Elias pulled his wool coat tighter around him and looked toward the harbor. The water was a deep, bruised purple under the twilight sky. Fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings, their masts swaying in a slow, synchronized dance. There was no shouting here, no sirens, just the rhythmic slap-slap of water against the docks and the lonely, haunting cry of a distant gull. Elias began to walk toward the old Anchor Inn, a place he had found on a whim during a particularly stressful Tuesday afternoon in his office. The inn was a 3-story Victorian building that sat on a slight rise overlooking the sea. Its white paint was weathered by decades of salt air, giving it a soft, matte finish that seemed to glow in the fading light. Warm, amber light spilled from the downstairs windows, promising a hearth and a heavy quilt. As he walked, the silence of the town began to wrap around him. In the city, silence was an absence of noise, a void to be filled. Here, the silence was a presence. It was thick and textured, filled with the history of the wind and the slow growth of the pines. Elias found himself slowing his pace. There was no reason to hurry. The inn wasn't going anywhere. The sea wasn't going anywhere. He reached the front door, a heavy slab of dark mahogany with a brass knocker shaped like a compass rose. When he lifted and dropped the knocker, the sound was deep and resonant, echoing through the house. A moment later, the door creaked open to reveal a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held the calm clarity of a tide pool. "You must be Elias," she said, her voice a gentle, melodic alto. "I'm Sarah. We've been expecting you. Come in, out of the damp." The entryway smelled of wood smoke, dried lavender, and the faint, sweet aroma of baking bread. It was a smell that instantly reached into Elias's chest and untied a knot he hadn't even realized was there. Sarah didn't ask for a credit card or a digital confirmation. She simply handed him a heavy iron key and pointed toward the stairs. "Your room is at the top," she whispered. "The North Star Suite. It has the best view of the lighthouse. Sleep well, Elias. The morning will be here whenever you choose to wake up." Elias thanked her and climbed the stairs. Each step offered a small, friendly creak, a sound that felt like the house was acknowledging his arrival. When he reached the 3rd floor and opened the door to his room, he stopped in his tracks. The room was bathed in the soft blue light of the moon. A massive 4-poster bed stood in the center, covered in layers of thick, hand-stitched quilts in shades of navy and cream. A small stone fireplace sat in the corner, a pre-laid fire waiting for a single match. but it was the window that drew him forward. The window was a large arched frame that looked directly out over the bay. In the distance, the lighthouse on Curtis Island blinked, a steady, rhythmic pulse of white light. 1, 2, 3, fade. 1, 2, 3, fade. It was a heartbeat for the coastline, a reminder that even in the dark, there was a constant watching presence. Elias sat in the armchair by the window, not even bothering to turn on the lamps. He watched the light. He listened to the wind as it brushed against the eaves of the house. He felt the weight of his own body, the way his muscles finally felt heavy and relaxed against the fabric of the chair. His mind, which usually raced with tomorrow's problems, began to settle on the details of the present. The texture of the wool rug beneath his feet, the way the moonlight silvered the tops of the waves, the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere on the floor below. He stayed there for a long time, just observing. He wasn't thinking, not really. He was just being. He was a witness to the night. He realized then that he had spent years moving through life without actually inhabiting it. He had been a passenger in his own days. But here, in this quiet room, he felt grounded. He felt real. Eventually, the coolness of the room prompted him to light the fire. He struck a match and watched as the flame took hold of the kindling. The orange light danced across the walls, casting long, soft shadows. The crackle of the wood was a comforting, domestic sound. It was the sound of safety. He began to undress slowly, each movement deliberate. He folded his clothes and placed them on the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He felt the coolness of the air on his skin before he slid beneath the heavy quilts. The sheets were crisp and smelled of sunshine and wind, as if they had been dried on a line near the sea. The bed was perfect. It was firm enough to support him, but soft enough to let him sink in just a little. He lay on his back, his hands folded over his chest, watching the embers of the fire glow in the dark. The lighthouse continued its steady pulse. Blink, fade, blink, fade. His breathing began to synchronize with the light. Deep, slow inhalations of the pine-scented air. Long, easy exhalations that released the last bit of tension from his toes to his jaw. He felt as though he were floating on the dark water of the bay, supported by the tide, carried by a force much larger and much older than himself. The world outside Camden, the world of deadlines and demands, felt like a story he had read a long time ago. It was a different reality, one that had no power here. In this room, in this bed, there was only the fire, the lighthouse, and the deep, restorative silence of the Maine coast. Elias closed his eyes. The last thing he felt was the gentle weight of the quilt and the profound, beautiful realization that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. When Elias woke the following morning, the world was a soft, muted grey. There was no sudden jolt of consciousness, no immediate reach for a phone to check the time. Instead, he simply opened his eyes and watched the way the mist pressed against the window pane. The lighthouse pulse from the night before was gone, replaced by a thick silver fog that had rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the harbour and the trees in a quiet, protective blanket. He lay still for a long time, listening to the house breathe. The old Anchor Inn was an old building, and like all old buildings, it had its own language. There was the occasional muffled thump of a heavy door closing downstairs, the faint hiss of the radiator as it warmed the room, and the distant rhythmic shushing of the waves against the shore. It was a symphony of small, gentle sounds that didn't demand a response. They simply existed. Elias eventually pushed back the heavy quilts. The air in the room was cool, but not uncomfortably so. He walked across the wide planked wooden floor, feeling the slight unevenness of the boards beneath his feet, a reminder of the craftsman who had laid them over a century ago. He dressed slowly, choosing a thick charcoal sweater and soft trousers. Each action felt intentional, a ceremony of preparing for a day that had no agenda. He made his way down the stairs, the banister smooth and cool under his hand. In the dining room, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon. Sarah was there, moving with a quiet, effortless grace as she set a table near the window. "Good morning, Elias," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "The fog has decided to stay for breakfast. I hope you don't mind a slow start." "I don't mind at all," Elias replied. He sat down at a small table, covered in a white linen cloth. Sarah brought him a heavy ceramic mug of coffee and a small bowl of oatmeal topped with blueberries and a drizzle of Maine maple syrup. The food was simple and honest. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the steam against his face and the sweet, earthy flavor of the syrup. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he had actually tasted his breakfast. In his other life, food was fuel consumed while reading emails or walking to a meeting. Here, the oatmeal was an event. The coffee was a comfort. As he watched the fog outside, he noticed how it changed the way he saw the world. Without the distraction of the distant horizon or the bright colors of the harbor, his focus narrowed. He saw the individual droplets of water clinging to a spider web on the porch railing. He saw the deep, mossy green of the pine needles just outside the glass. The world felt smaller, more intimate, and infinitely safer. After breakfast, Elias decided to venture out. He stepped onto the porch and was immediately enveloped by the mist. It felt like walking into a cloud. The air was damp and cool against his skin, smelling of salt and wet cedar. He began to walk down toward the center of Camden, his footsteps muffled by the fog. The town was quiet. The shops along Main Street were just beginning to open their doors, but there was no bustle. A shopkeeper was sweeping the sidewalk in front of a bookstore, the rhythmic scritch-scratch of the broom the only sound in the street. Elias nodded a greeting, and the man nodded back, a silent acknowledgement between two people who were in no hurry. He walked past the library and toward the harbor park. Usually, this was a place of vibrant activity, with tourists and sailors and the white sails of schooners. But today, the harbor was a ghost world. The masts of the boats rose out of the fog like skeletal fingers, and the water was as flat and grey as a sheet of pewter. Elias found a green wooden bench near the water's edge and sat down. He pulled his collar up against the dampness. He watched a single buoy bobbing in the distance, its low, mournful bell tolling with the movement of the tide. Clang, clang. The sound was deep and hollow, echoing through the mist. It was a lonely sound, but it wasn't a sad one. It was a signal of safety, a guide for those lost in the grey. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the harbor wash over him. The creak of a dock, the distant hum of a boat engine, the soft, wet slap of the water. He felt the tension in his mind continuing to unravel. The thoughts that usually crowded his head, the projects, the deadlines, the expectations, felt thin and transparent, like the fog itself. They were there, but they had no weight. They couldn't touch him. He stayed on the bench for nearly an hour, simply breathing in the salt air. He felt a deep sense of stillness settling into his bones. It was a feeling of being completely present, of having nowhere else to be, and nothing else to do. He was just a man on a bench in the fog, and that was enough. It was more than enough. Eventually, he stood up and began the walk back to the inn. He took a longer route, wandering through the quiet residential streets where the houses were tucked behind hedges of wild roses and hydrangeas. The flowers were faded now, their petals a dusty blue and brown, but they held a different kind of beauty in the autumn mist. When he returned to the old Anchor Inn, Sarah was in the parlor, tending to the fire. "The library has a wonderful collection of old maps," she mentioned without looking up from the hearth. "And there's a fresh pot of tea on the sideboard. You look like a man who has found a bit of peace out there." "I think I have," Elias said. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the parlor, sitting in a wingback chair near the fire. He didn't read. He didn't write. He simply watched the flames. He watched the way the wood turned from solid brown to glowing red, then to fine silver ash. It was a slow, beautiful transformation. The warmth of the fire made him drowsy. He leaned his head back against the chair and let his eyes drift shut. He wasn't falling into a deep sleep, but rather a soft, waking dream. He felt the house around him, a sturdy vessel protecting him from the damp and the cold. He felt the rhythm of the sea, a constant, underlying pulse that had been there long before he arrived and would be there long after he left. In this quiet space, Elias realized that the quiet place to rest wasn't just the inn or the town of Camden. It was the space he was making in his own heart. It was the permission he was finally giving himself to just stop, to let the world go on without him for a while, to trust that everything would be okay if he simply took a breath. The afternoon light began to fade, the grey mist outside turning into a deep, velvety indigo. The fire in the hearth settled into a steady, golden glow. Elias felt a profound sense of contentment. He was warm. He was safe. He was at rest. As the blue hour of twilight deepened into the true dark of a coastal night, the fog that had hugged the town all day began to lose its grip. A light breeze stirred from the north, whispering through the eaves of the inn and gently peeling back the layers of mist. Elias remained in his seat by the parlor fire for a long while, watching this slow unveiling. Through the window, the world began to reappear in fragments. First, the dark silhouette of the jagged pines, then the faint shimmering reflection of a single star in a puddle on the porch. The transition from day to night felt like a soft sigh. There was no rush to turn on the overhead lights. In the parlor, the only illumination came from the dying embers of the hearth and a small, green-shaded library lamp on a side table. It was a room of shadows and soft edges, a place where a person could feel completely hidden and perfectly safe. Dinner at the old Anchor Inn was served in the same quiet manner as every other event in this house. Elias moved into the dining room, where a single candle burned on each table, its flame steady and tall. The air was now scented with the comforting, savory aroma of a slow-cooked beef stew and the yeasty sweetness of crusty bread. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She placed a steaming bowl in front of him, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "The stars are coming out," she said softly, nodding toward the window. "It's going to be a cold, clear night, the kind of night where you can hear the ocean breathing from miles away." Elias thanked her and began to eat. Every bite was an exercise in mindfulness. He felt the warmth of the stew spreading through him, a physical manifestation of the comfort he felt in this house. He noticed the weight of the silver spoon in his hand, the texture of the linen napkin, and the way the candlelight glinted off the rim of his water glass. In the silence of the room, he felt a strange, new sensation. He was not lonely. He was simply alone, and for the first time, that felt like a luxury. He realized that for most of his life, he had been afraid of the quiet. He had filled his days with podcasts, music, and the constant chatter of the internet. But here, in the dim light of the dining room, the silence felt like a companion. It was a space where his own thoughts could finally stretch out and settle down. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't meeting anyone's expectations. He was just a man eating dinner in the middle of a quiet Maine night. After he finished, Elias felt a sudden desire to see the stars Sarah had mentioned. He put on his heavy coat and stepped back out onto the porch. The change in the air was immediate. The damp, heavy mist was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like looking through a polished lens. The sky was an immense velvet canopy of deepest black, crowded with more stars than Elias had ever seen in his life. They weren't just tiny points of light. They felt three-dimensional, some burning with a cold blue fire, others glowing with a soft, steady gold. The Milky Way was a bright, frosted path across the center of the sky, a river of light that seemed to pulse with its own ancient rhythm. Elias stood at the railing, his head tilted back, and felt a profound sense of awe. In the city, the sky was a ceiling, obscured by the orange glow of streetlights. Here, the sky was a window into the infinite. The cold was bracing, but it felt good. It made him feel alive and grounded. He listened, as Sarah had suggested, and he could indeed hear the ocean. It wasn't the crashing of waves, but a low, rhythmic thrum, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of the Atlantic moving against the granite bones of the coast, rising, falling, constant, eternal. He began to walk down the driveway, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the property where the trees gave way to a small clearing. He stood there for a long time, watching the North Star hang steady above the horizon. He thought about the sailors who had navigated these waters for centuries, using that same light to find their way home. There was something deeply reassuring about that continuity. The world changed, lives began and ended, but the stars remained. The rhythm of the tide remained. As he stood in the dark, Elias found himself reflecting on the man he had been just a few days ago. That man had been tired in a way that sleep alone couldn't fix. He had been a man of lists and worries, a man who lived in the future or the past, but never in the present. He felt a wave of compassion for that version of himself. He realized that the tiredness had been a sign, a message from his body and soul that it was time to stop, and he had listened. He turned back toward the inn, the white walls of the building glowing like a beacon in the starlight. The windows of the parlor were still warm with the orange light of the fire, and he could see the faint silhouette of Sarah moving in the kitchen. It was a picture of peace, a portrait of a world at rest. Inside, the transition back to the warmth was like a physical embrace. He hung his coat on the brass hook in the hallway and made his way back up the creaking stairs. With every step, he felt his body becoming more relaxed, more ready for the deep surrender of sleep. He reached the North Star suite and pushed open the door. The fire he had lit earlier in the afternoon had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, casting a soft, pulsing light across the room. He didn't turn on the lamps. He moved through the shadows, his movements fluid and slow. He went to the window and looked out one last time. The lighthouse on Curtis Island was back, its white beam cutting through the clear night air with a steady, reliable rhythm. Blink. 1, 2, 3. Fade. Blink. 1, 2, 3. Fade. It was a silent lullaby, a visual heartbeat that felt like it was keeping time for the entire coast. Elias watched it for a long time, his own breathing slowing down to match the light. He felt a deep, settled peace in his chest. He was no longer a visitor here. He was a part of this quiet landscape. He prepared for bed with a sense of reverence. He washed his face with the cool water from the ceramic pitcher, feeling the refreshing clarity of it. He slid into the bed, the heavy quilts welcoming him back. The sheets were still cool, but they quickly warmed to his body. He lay on his side, watching the embers of the fire in the grate. The room was silent, save for the faint, distant tolling of the buoy bell in the harbor. Clang, clang. It was a sound that didn't disrupt the silence, but rather emphasized it. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of home. Elias closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, his mind was quiet. There were no lists, no worries, no shadows of tomorrow. There was only the warmth of the quilt, the rhythm of the lighthouse, and the deep, dark, beautiful night of Maine. The final morning in Camden arrived with a clarity that felt like a bell ringing in the crisp air. The sun rose not behind a veil of fog, but with a triumphant golden light that turned the surface of the bay into a sheet of hammered gold. Elias woke early, but this time there was no heaviness in his limbs. Instead, he felt a light, buoyant energy, as if the quiet of the past few days had finally reached into the deep corners of his spirit and dusted them off. He lay in bed for a few minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierced the room. They moved in slow, chaotic, yet peaceful circles, drifting on the slight currents of air. He felt a strange sense of kinship with them. He too was simply drifting in the light, part of a larger, silent dance that required no effort and no explanation. He dressed for one last walk before his train was due. He didn't pack his bags yet. He wanted to keep the room as it was, a sanctuary, until the very last moment. He walked down the stairs, and this time, he found Sarah in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. The rhythmic thump-fold of her work was the only sound in the house. "The world is wide open today, Elias," she said, looking up with a small, knowing smile. "It's a good day for a long view." "I thought I'd walk out toward the point," Elias replied. "Take the path by the old stone wall," she suggested. "The moss is especially vibrant after the rain. It's a quiet way to say goodbye." Elias followed her advice. The path led him away from the harbor and toward the rugged, wooded edge of the coast. To his right, the Atlantic stretched out toward the horizon, a deep, sparkling sapphire. To his left, the woods were a tapestry of late autumn colors, deep rusts, burnt oranges, and the steadfast dark green of the pines. The air was cold enough to turn his breath into small, fleeting clouds, but the sun on his back was warm and constant. He found the stone wall Sarah had mentioned. It was an old boundary built by hands that had long since returned to the earth, but it stood firm. The stones were covered in thick, velvet-like moss that glowed with an almost neon intensity in the morning light. He reached out and touched it. It was soft and damp, a tiny, resilient forest living on the hard surface of the rock. He walked until he reached the very tip of the point, where the granite rocks met the sea in a series of jagged shelves. He found a flat spot and sat down, his legs dangling over the edge. Below him, the water swirled in deep pools, crystal clear and teeming with the quiet life of the tide. He watched a single piece of kelp swaying in the current, its long amber ribbons moving with a hypnotic liquid grace. He sat there for a long time, simply watching the ocean. He thought about the man who had arrived here a few days ago, his mind a tangled web of noise. That man seemed like a distant relative now, someone he knew well, but no longer was. He realized that the quiet place he had found wasn't just a destination in Maine. It was a capacity he had rediscovered within himself. He could take the rhythm of the tide back with him. He could take the pulse of the lighthouse and the silence of the fog. The quiet place to rest was a sanctuary he now carried in his own heart. He felt a deep sense of completion. He didn't need any more sights. He didn't need any more conversations. He was full. He stood up, brushed the granite dust from his trousers, and began the walk back to the inn. He moved with a steady, relaxed pace, his eyes taking in the details of the path one last time. Every pine cone, every lichen-covered branch, every shimmer of light on the water was a gift he was tucking away for later. Back at the old Anchor Inn, the process of packing was a final meditation. He placed each item in his suitcase with care, acknowledging the service each had provided, the heavy sweater that had kept him warm in the fog, the boots that had carried him over the cobblestones, the book he had barely read, because the world outside had been a better story. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the North Star Suite and looked around. The room was exactly as he had found it, clean, quiet, and waiting for the next traveler who needed a place to hide. He felt a wave of gratitude for the four walls, the heavy quilts, and the view of the lighthouse. He carried his bag downstairs and found Sarah at the front desk. He handed her the heavy iron key. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice steady and calm, "for everything." "You're very welcome, Elias," she replied. She reached out and patted his hand. "Remember, the sea is always here, and the quiet is always here. You just have to remember how to listen for it." He walked out the front door and down the steps. The sun was high now, and the town was moving with its gentle late-morning rhythm. He walked to the station, and as the train pulled onto the platform, he didn't feel the usual spike of anxiety about the journey ahead. He felt as though he were merely moving from one room of a large, peaceful house to another. He found a seat by the window as the train began its slow crawl back toward the city. He watched the main coastline disappear, the pines and the granite rocks fading into the distance. He watched the small towns go by, each with its own steeples and its own quiet stories. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in long streaks of violet and gold, Elias leaned his head back against the seat. The rhythmic clack-clack, clack-clack of the train tracks was a new lullaby, a steady beat that carried him forward. He closed his eyes and visualized the harbor in Camden. He saw the fog rolling in. He heard the tolling of the buoy bell. He felt the weight of the hand-stitched quilts. He wasn't sleeping yet, but he was drifting. He was in that beautiful, liminal space between the world of doing and the world of being. He felt the tension in his jaw melt away. He felt his shoulders drop. He felt his breath become long and shallow, a gentle tide in his own chest. The world outside the train continued its frantic pace, but inside Elias, there was only the quiet. He was safe. He was warm. He was at rest. And as the darkness of the evening settled over the landscape, he let himself go. He let himself sink into the deep, restorative silence that he had finally learned to call his own. The journey was long, but it didn't matter. He was already home. He was already at peace. And in the quiet of his own mind, the lighthouse continued to blink, a steady, rhythmic pulse of light that would guide him through every night to come. Blink. 1, 2, 3. Blink. 1, 2, 3. Sleep came then, like a gentle wave, and Elias finally let the world drift away, leaving only the beautiful, perfect silence of a soul at rest.